Hello, everyone. Welcome to your favorite point of the week. We're on our last chapter, Death and Dying. That's chapter 10. I just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone for being in my class. You may have entered this class or different psychology classes with certain preconceptions of psychology, and I hope through the rigor of this course you were able to learn about the implications and how difficult it is to understand human behavior, not just in the United States, but across the world, and not just in young children, but throughout the lifespan. So thanks again. I know it can be challenging at times, but I hope you feel good about being able to complete this class and making it this far. All right, so let's jump into this. Beginning with the question, what is death? Well, I'm not going to solve that existential crisis for you, or solve the mysteries of the universe, but we're going to work with a couple definitions here, beginning with biological death. It's not a single event. It's a complex process. Different systems of the body die at different rates. Some people who have stopped breathing or lack a heartbeat would have been declared dead in another historical period, can now be revived. Life support machines can be used to keep blood circulation going, even after brain activity has, or much brain activity has stopped functioning in an individual. Harvard Medical School in 1968 defined biological death as total brain death, irreversible loss of functioning in the entire brain, higher centers involved in conscious awareness, and lower centers that control basic life processes. So kind of you see the historical effects here of impacting what the definition of death means. Obviously, we have more medical equipment today, more technology, which allows individuals to remain, alive, or again, depends how you define life, but maintaining a heartbeat, for months or years, after brain activity has mostly or completely stopped functioning. Especially the higher centers of the brain, which is conscious awareness, which is what we typically think of as your human side. While your lower centers of your brain, kind of your brainstem area, just dealing with basic biological processes such as breathing, pumping blood, so kind of as stated, basic biological processes. But just kind of another example of the history of the moment impacting our definitions of psychological concepts, in this case, what death is. The American Academy of Neurology has created some guidelines to be judged dead, and we're going to walk through those. The first is that an individual has to be totally unresponsive to stimuli, including painful ones. Failed to move for 1 hour and failed to breathe for 3 minutes after being removed from a ventilator. No reflexes, no electrical activity in the brain. So again, kind of different disciplines defining deaths in different ways. And now let's talk about different ways of death, dying, and continue on. Well, as we continue on our discussion of what is death, and beginning with euthanasia. Quote, happy or, quote, good death that usually refers to hastening the death of someone suffering from an incurable illness or injury. Active euthanasia is characterized as a mercy killing, deliberately and directly causing a person's death, administering a lethal dose of drugs to a pain-racked patient in the late stages of cancer, for example. Passive euthanasia, withholding extraordinary life-saving treatment, allowing a terminally ill person to die of natural causes, withholding extraordinary life-saving treatments, such as a feeding tube, for example. And assisted suicide, making available to a person who wishes to die the means by which she may do so. A doctor writing a prescription for sleeping pills at the request of a terminally ill patient who has an active desire to die. So we have kind of different conceptualizations of what a good death is, what a meaningful death is, what a happy death is, and different approaches to achieving that developmental milestone. And those approaches can be active, such as providing lethal doses from a doctor, to passive, so withholding particular medical technology, which may leave the patient alive and maybe just in a vegetative state, for example. So removing medical technology to creating death through passive euthanasia. Death is also a psychological and social process. Aries argues social meanings of death have changed over the course of history. Since the late 19th century, Western societies have engaged in a, quote, denial of death, have taken death out of homes and into hospitals, funeral homes, less direct experience with it than our ancestors did. So what this researcher is arguing is that through technology and kind of a denial of death, of mortality in Western societies, due to a host of technological advances and kind of just this immortality kind of associated with in particular cultures and particular ideologies bred within particular cultures in the West, creating or kind of lending to a set of cultural practices wherein we kind of hide death from our society at large. And one example being of deaths occurring in hospitals and funeral homes and kind of just having less direct interactions with death than previous generations. And as I stated, there are also different kinds of death, and social death being one of them. And social death occurs when others begin to dehumanize and withdraw from someone who is terminally ill or has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Dehumanization includes ignoring them, talking about them if they are not present, making decisions without consulting them first, and forcing unwanted procedures. So kind of the idea here is that a loss of autonomy for an individual who may or previously had autonomy, and for kind of the purposes of this theory, that they want autonomy, and they're caregivers of this individual, or parents, spouse, whoever has legal custody or who has the capability of making medical decisions on behalf of that person, kind of ignoring the person who's terminally ill or diagnosed with a terminal illness, thus creating this lack of autonomy being characterized as social death, particularly within cultures, that are highly individualized and and have those particular values. And I wanted to bring into class some talk about cultural variation in grieving. There is no universal way to grieve. Funerals are an occasion for avoiding people or holding parties, for fighting or having sexual orgies, for weeping and laughing, in 1,000 different combinations. Mexican American mourners do more touching, viewing, and kissing of the deceased than white Americans. Black Americans tend to regard the funeral as a forum for expressing grief. Japanese Americans are socialized to restrain their grief, to smile so as not to burden others with their pain. Irish Americans have traditionally believed that the dead deserve a good send-off, a wake with food, jokes, drinks, the kind of party the deceased might have enjoyed. So as I stated, there's different ways for cultures to grieve, and thus you can see wildly different social practices for grieving the death of an individual within their community. Next, I want to talk about some social factors of the lifelong health, lifespans, and the life expectancy of individuals within a given country or in a social context, and specifically about income inequality. The subjective perceptions of wealth are also predictive of health. So I want to talk about the subjective perception of health real quick. And basically what this is saying is that the subjective experience of feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. A sense of relative deprivation, knowing others are doing better than you, may lead to stress and negative health consequences. There is something to be said about the health benefits of having some money in general, such as the countries that are on the left of the scatter plot. It allows people to have access to life-sustaining cultural practices such as medication, but beyond a certain level, objective wealth does not predict life expectancy very well. This is particularly problematic in societies where there is a great social inequality. The relationship between a country's Gini coefficient, which is the index of income inequality, and average life expectancy is strongly negative. R equals 0.8. All right, so let's unpack this a little bit. So we've talked about throughout this class of the effects of class, of wealth, on individual developmental outcomes, or collective developmental outcomes, I should say. There's also research to support that feelings of not just the objective measures of how how much wealth or what class an individual's in, but also the subjective rating expressed by a poor individual being correlated with poor developmental health outcomes. And that could just be kind of acknowledgement and understanding by an individual, that you're struggling in life, and that you have stress, and that you're aware that these stressful circumstances through class differences in a particular society can lead to negative health outcomes. So the takeaway is it's not just that experiencing and objective measures of income inequality or poverty, class, but also there is a correlation between the subjective experience of feeling poor. So just kind of your general feelings about every day, your stress levels, your mood, etc. Also, culture. There's a correlation between countries that are high income and countries who are lower income. So those kind of overexploited, formerly colonial states, or countries, I should say, kind of having a correlation with health outcomes. But interestingly, you see that once you hit a certain amount of wealth, that correlation becomes less strong. So kind of the lower levels of wealth or income inequality, or I should say countries' wealth, their GDP, being highly correlated with health outcomes for their citizens. But the more money you hit, beginning around $30,000 per capita GDP, the less in strength that correlation becomes, that correlation between income and health outcomes becomes weaker as you get above $30,000. And there can be a whole lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is traditionally in industrialized countries, there are stronger social safety nets that allow all individuals to gain access to particular cultural practices of medicine and medical technology. And you can see that correlation kind of getting muddled a little bit when you look at the United States, where we do not have a universal healthcare system. So the country with the highest GDP, or top two depending on your measure, also having relatively poor, compared to other industrialized countries, other high-income countries, having poor health outcomes. And this is reflective in shorter lifespans, for example. But interestingly, you also see a correlation between a country's Gini index, which is a measure of income inequality within a country, and average life expectancy. And it's a negative correlation. So what does that mean? So calling back from our previous chapters, a negative correlation is the higher, I should say, the Gini coefficient index, which again, that would mean the higher levels of income inequality is associated with lower average life expectancies within a country. So it's negative. So it's a negative correlation. So one of the measures go up and one of the measures goes down. So again, as income inequality goes up, life expectancy goes down. And that's a 0.8 correlation. So that's a very strong correlation you should remember. And this is just a quick bar graph of different life expectancies by race and gender. And we're going to get into some more specifics about this momentarily. And this is just kind of a large graph that I found interesting. And it just kind of a little more detail of what I spoke about before. But in this case here, they compare race and ethnic groups in the United States, comparing white and black Americans and white and Latino Americans, and to determine which group is most impacted by particular diseases. So you can see that here on the left-hand side, and also another bar graph and scatter plot that I was talking about before, wherein there is a relationship between your income levels up until you hit around $30,000. And this could be reflective in the fact that once you hit that level, that's when you're kind of living in a country that's high income enough to provide you a kind of a solid social safety net, aka a national health care plan. While poorer countries, don't have those the financial resources available to them. But once you hit a certain income kind of a level or wealth level within a country, then theoretically you at least have the resources to provide those sources. Those financial resources, those cultural practices of medicine. Of course, it's not true, and there's differences with the United States and other poor countries doing very well in healthcare measures, such as Cuba, but that's kind of the general pattern. And then we see annual household income being associated with expected ages of death. And you can see, unsurprisingly, the more money you have in the United States in this study in this study occurring between 2001 and 2014, the more money you have, the higher your age of death is going to be. And that's, again, kind of unsurprising from, based on all the literature we covered in this class and the fact that there's really not a national healthcare system once you in the United States, besides Medicare, which does not kick in until your mid-60s. And I also wanted to talk about the epidemiological paradox. And this, so kind of research finds that poor and racial minorities cross-culturally are at higher risk of adverse health outcomes. But not all disadvantaged minorities have adverse health situations. Latinos in the United States, for example, and researchers are not exactly sure why. Although they tend to exercise less, Latino Americans tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos. Cultural factors in Latino communities also contribute to relatively good health. High value placed on raising families, emotional support provided by families and community members, and unusually high levels of positive emotion. Paradox, however, does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexican Americans. So interestingly, we see here kind of an ethnic group effect, an interaction, wherein research has typically shown that poor individuals and racial minorities being at higher risk for adverse health outcomes for a wide amount of reasons, historical disenfranchisement against racial minorities, and still ongoing disenfranchisement for poor individuals and racial minorities. Medical debt, I believe, it's in the top 3 of the reasons for bankruptcy in the United States. So kind of that medical debt, the cost of medical treatment in the United States, kind of acting as a barrier for that most impact, or disproportionately impact, I should say, racial minorities and people in lower classes. But interestingly, for Latino Americans, there's kind of a buffer effect. And a couple of proposed reasons, we have maybe different eating habits, different smoking habits, drinking habits, but also kind of maybe buffering effects occurring at a family level and at a community level with community members, family members providing each other emotional support, and placing high value in kind of raising children on collectively, which can maybe help spread out those caregiving responsibilities, and thus kind of distributing that caregiving stress that an individual may experience as a minority in the United States, or a poor individual in the United States. So kind of distributing maybe that stress, but also distributing that protection, that buffering effect, and thus kind of limiting and the negative effects of being a racial minority or a poor individual within the United States. And now kind of just like a broad overview of the leading causes of death. For preschool and school-age children, the leading cause of death is unintentional injuries such as car accidents. For adolescents and early adulthood, car accidents, homicides, and suicides. The 45 to 64 age group, cancers, and 65 years and older, heart disease. Now we're going to move on to the experience of death. And this is kind of the classic 5 stages of dying. The first being denial, defensive mechanism, anxiety-provoking thoughts are kept out of conscious awareness. Anger, so questions like, why me? Bargaining, where a bargainer begs for some concession from God, the medical staff, or family members. Depression, which straightforward, has depression, despair, and a sense of hopelessness become the predominant emotional acceptance responses. And then acceptance, which is accept the inevitability of death in a calm and peaceful manner. And what are some criticisms of the 5 stages of dying? Emotional responses to dying are not stage-like. The nature and course of an illness affects reactions to it. Individuals differ widely in their responses. Dying people focus on living, not just dying. So kind of breaking this down, we've talked about stage-like throughout this course. So kind of a quick reminder at each stage, if you can imagine like a stair step with each stair representing a stage wherein you acquire all kinds of new abilities, or just kind of, and then you leave like kind of your past behind. It's kind of the idea. Or you can't really modify it. You're set in stone, and you've because you're on a new stage, and it's not a gradual kind of progression of these ability, or in this case like stages of dying, but rather you just one day have it. It's boom, you got this stage, and everything is a sudden kind of burst of development. And the criticism is that emotional responses to dying are not stage-like. So maybe you are accepting of some aspects, maybe you're depressed about some things, and maybe you're angry about some things. So you can be in you can have multiple feelings occurring at the same time. So you're not just in that clean stage where, okay, I'm at anger, therefore I'm not depressed, therefore I've accepted nothing, I'm no longer in denial kind of thing, but rather having multiple emotions going on at the same time suggests that this is not a stage-like process. The stages of dying and how you feel about dying also depend on the illness. So if you maybe have an illness that you've had your entire life and you've lived till 95 years old, maybe you're more accepting than a random car accident when you're 20 years old. Individuals differ widely in their responses, and dying people focus on living, not just dying. So kind of these 5 stages of death deal exclusively with kind of working your way through the fact that you're going to die, rather than using at least some of that time to focus on living and what particular things that you enjoy, for example. So one study found that dying patients have goals, and what the researchers were trying to do was kind of just understand their perspectives on dying. And the first goal that this study found was controlling dying, primarily by focusing on their chemotherapy or other treatments, but also for some by holding in their back of their mind the possibility of suicide if necessary, valuing life in the present, getting the most out of the remaining time, even if they can no longer make long-term plans, and creating a living legacy, getting their affairs in order, creating good memories in their children, and touching others' lives. So kind of the idea here is that among these individuals, them having particular perspectives on death. And the first 3 that we're going to talk about is controlling death. So kind of just, and this is maybe more found in Western cultures, but or found in particular ways within particular cultures. But in this case, kind of just controlling how you're going to die, so dealing with your therapy and just having options if you know if you want active euthanasia or passive euthanasia. So maybe, and also, for example, maybe signing a do not resuscitate order, or just kind of having plans, controlling your final days alive. But also enjoying your final days of life, and possibly creating a living legacy. So kind of get your things organized, maybe, I don't know, whatever. Working with individuals you care about within a particular community or family. So just kind of having that last few days focus on creating lifelong positive memories for individuals who are living after your death. Perspectives on bereavement. Bereavement is defined as a state of loss, Grief is an emotional response to loss, and mourning is a culturally prescribed way of displaying reactions to death. So just a few basic definitions before we jump into some particular theories. So the Parks-Bowlby attachment model of bereavement argues that there are four prominent reactions to death. The first is numbness, which is in a dazed sense of unreality and disbelief and almost empty of feelings. Yearning, a time of acute separation anxiety and efforts to reunite with a lost loved one. Disorganization and despair, at the realization of reunion with loved one is impossible. Depression, despair, and apathy predominate. And reorganization, invest less emotional energy in their attachment to disease and more in their attachment to the living. So kind of the idea here is that there are different reactions to death, so in particular bereavement. And on the right hand side you can see kind of estimated based on their research periods of bereavement, and you can see that the different reactions of bereavement occur at different times and last longer than some other ones, on average. Another model of bereavement is a dual process model. And the bereaved oscillate, often unpredictably, between coping with the emotional blow of the loss and coping with practical challenges of the living. There's loss-oriented coping, which involves dealing with one's emotions and reconciling oneself of the loss. Restoration-oriented coping, which focuses on managing daily living, rethinking one's life, mastering new roles and challenges that come following the loss of a loved one. And over time, emphasis shifts from loss-oriented to restoration-oriented coping, also seen at the family level of child's death. So kind of the idea here is that we have different, at an individual level, different orientations to coping. And individuals bounce back and go back and forth between those approaches to coping. And over time, the likelihood of using loss-oriented style of coping becomes less, and individuals spend more time on restoration-oriented coping. Now, interestingly, these researchers also argue that this doesn't just occur at an individual level, but also at a family level. So these family dynamics, wherein they also have these two stages, or I should say two different approaches of coping, which the family bounces back and forth between on a familial level. And probably I would argue that you can maybe see this at a country level, but definitely at a community level if some important member of the community dies, and individuals at a community level experiencing different levels of loss-oriented coping and restoration-oriented coping through time. So I structured this lecture kind of into into groupings based on the age of an individual, and I'm just going to kind of walk through infant, adolescent, and older adults. So let's start with infants. And infants do not grasp death as cessation of life, may grasp the concepts of being and non-being. Bowlby argues for three phases: protest, which is yearning and searching for the loved ones, expressing outrage when they fail; despair, which is displaying depression-like symptoms; lose hope, and search becomes sad; and detachment takes renewed interest in toys and companions. Infants recover most when they can rely on an existing attachment figure or can attach to someone who is sensitive and responsive. So kind of the idea here is that infants, it's difficult for a month-old child to understand what death is for a whole host of cognitive reasons, and kind of the research supports that infants will rely on existing attachment figures or someone who can act as a new attachment figure to buffer the pain of someone not being in their life anymore, even if they don't fully understand that an individual's death is dead. Grasping the concept of death, young children. Children are highly curious about death. They think about it with some frequency, build it into their play, and can talk about it. In Western cultures, these following bullet points will be especially true, but there is a greater understanding, a more mature understanding of death. They understand on a higher level of finality, which is the cessation of life and all of life processes, irreversibility, which it cannot be undone, universality, it is inevitable and happens to all living things, and biological causality, which is a result of natural processes, even if external causes set off these internal changes. So you can kind of see here why this would have a Western cultural bias in it, just because we have particular Western notions of what death is, what afterlife is, what recreation is, so, etc. But these are kind of the ways in which, on average, children in Western societies begin to conceptualize death. And continuing on in that vein, grasping the concept of death in childhood, children's understanding of death is influenced by their cognitive development. Piaget argued that concrete operational stage allowed children to better understand death when children are acquiring logical operations and can reason effectively about real objects and experiences. So I just want to provide a definition of concrete operational stage abilities. Cultural experiences. Cultures differs on how much children should protect children from the idea of death. In life experiences, children who have had personal experience with a death in their immediate extended family often have more mature understandings of death. So kind of like a classic Piaget thing where he believes that certain abilities are unlocked in a stage-like process, and once children hit a certain stage in their development, they're now able to understand and logically reason about death and thus better understand death. You also have cultural experiences. So some cultures place priority on shielding children from the ideas of death, and other cultures put less priority in that, or choose to actively talk about death. And life experiences affecting the child. So if a child has a history or experience with death in their family, they're more likely to have a more deeper understanding of what death means, due to interacting with, having death happen in their life. Researchers have argued that children aged 5 to 7 understand death is final. Researchers also argue that adults make death more confusing and frightening to young children when they use euphemisms such as gone to sleep gone away asleep. And it's recommended to give simple but honest answers to children's questions about death. So kind of the idea here is that these euphemisms or these kind of indirect ways can often be counterproductive because they just make the child more confused or scared, end up frightening the children even more than what they originally were. The dying child. Dying children are more aware of what is happening to them than adults realize. Preschool children understand death is irreversible, experience many of the emotions that dying adults experience, avoid talking about it, or have open anxiety, need a strong sense that their parents are there to care for them, recommend to follow the child's lead, enabling children to talk about their feelings and answer questions simply and directly. So that's kind of the general takeaway for a lot of this research into death when dealing with children, is that children have a capability of understanding what's going on, and it's recommended that you answer the questions as simply and as directly as possible. In the case of a dying child, kind of taking their lead is recommended, as they can experience similar emotions to death or dying as adults can. So to allow the child to kind of lead can be quite useful for them, especially within particular cultures and Western societies. The bereaved child. Children grieve, express their grief differently than adults, and one theory why they do so is because they lack some of the coping resources of adults. Some children are vulnerable to long-term negative effects of bereavement. A longitudinal study of school-aged children found 1 in 5 children who lost a parent had serious adjustment problems 2 years after death. Most bereaved children are resilient and adapt. 2 to 5 years after loss, children who have experienced death of a parent typically look like non-bereaved children in socio-emotional and academic functioning. Children fare best when their caregiver maintains their own mental health, has a secure relationship with the child, and provides good parenting. So kind of the idea here is that children also grieve, but may grieve differently due to just less life experiences than an adult, and also kind of different because of those different experiences of adults, and because of what particular stages of development that they are in. They have different abilities and coping resources available to them. But as I stated, a longitudinal study found that about 25% of children who lost a parent had serious adjustment problems. So about 75% of children not having serious adjustment problems. And children faring best when they have a parent who can provide a secure relationship with them and provide good parenting to that child. And also it's important for that parent to have maintain their own mental health, because mental health of parents and or caregivers have been found to be associated with developmental outcomes in children. Children's symptoms of grief often differ by age. So preschoolers typically experience problems with sleeping, eating, toileting, and other daily routines, while older children's grief are more directly expressed, and somatic symptoms such as headaches are also common. So kind of just the idea that kind of straightforward, that older children are better able to understand concepts such as death better, and better able to express the concepts that they understand. So even though they may understand it, just not having an ability to cope with it or express their feelings, and that ability increases with age. Now looking at adolescents' understanding of death, their understanding advances with age. Adolescents typically understand death as the irreversible cessation of biological processes. They use their new cognitive capacities to ponder the meaning of death. Some think that psychological processes such as knowing, believing, and feelings continue. Among adolescents who adopt the belief that the soul or spirit lives on after death, that does not mean that they are giving up on biological understandings of death. These adolescents call upon both as needed and depending on the situation and what they're trying to explain. So kind of the idea here is that adolescents are understanding death at a deeper level, and they're trying to wrap their head around it, as every human has and throughout human history. So now they have new cognitive capacities, so kind of like this Piaget approach. But also, other researchers argue for this, and these new cognitive capacities allowing the child, or an adolescent, I should say, to really seriously consider what death means. And although some adolescents will believe that the individual who's dead still has particular psychological functionings that continue on in their death, this does not mean that they are kind of rejecting all biological notions of death, but kind of call on both biological and kind of these spiritual notions of death as needed. So sometimes they may leverage their biological causes more, and sometimes they may leverage these spiritual understandings of death as needed. The experience of death in adolescence and their reactions to it, becoming terminally ill, I should say, are likely to reflect the themes of adolescence. That is, their concerns with body image, wanting to be accepted by peers, and distress by having to depend on parents. So kind of the idea is that, maybe have a terminal illness, but oh man, I still don't want to stand out from my peers, and it's kind of embarrassing having to depend on my parents at higher levels than maybe some of my peers. So like an adolescent being diagnosed with a terminal illness, losing a parent also reflects the themes of adolescent. They're reluctant to express grief sometimes, they may engage in delinquent behavior, and they may have somatic ailments. Reactions to death of a parent, 30% in one study, 30% experienced significant grief in the first year following the death of a parent, and 10% 3 years later, and the rest experienced milder grief. More likely to suffer major depression, alcohol use, PTSD in the first year following the death of a parent. So kind of the idea here is that, again, you're seeing, although this can be, obviously is a very difficult time, the majority of adolescents experience milder forms of grief. And only 30% of adolescents who experience the death of a parent experiencing significant grief reactions, and that number declining to 10% 3 years later. But during the first year following the death of a parent. That's kind of thought to be typically in research where particular outcomes are most likely to occur, and that is major depression, alcohol abuse, and PTSD. Continuing on to the reactions to death of a parent, cortisol levels are higher in bereaved youth compared to non-bereaved youth, so kind of just biological evidence that they're experiencing higher levels of stress than their peers who are not bereaved, aka have not experienced the loss of a parent. Bereaved youth are less likely to have close attachment to peers, have more difficulty at work, lower educational aspirations, and less developed career plans. So those individuals who are kind of experiencing more severe symptoms of bereavement and grief, they're at risk for a host of negative developmental outcomes, which range from educational outcomes to social outcomes. So you can imagine a adolescent losing a parent or both their parents or a caregiver, and then becoming socially isolated, obviously feeling bad about it, and then being unable to form close attachment with their peers, thus leading to them becoming more socially isolated, and then you can see a cascading effect. When you can see all these variables here are definitely, there's a lot of shared natural covariation, aka they're kind of all kind of correlated. Lower educational aspirations associated with less developed career plans, for example. Those things kind of go hand in hand. Outcomes worse for those who lose mothers, blame others for their death, has had low self-esteem, using negative coping strategies, had a caregiver who was severely depressed. So although losing a parent as an adolescent is a risk factor for a host of poor developmental outcomes, we see developmental outcomes or poor developmental outcomes concentrated within individuals who already had low self-esteem prior to the death of their parents, who rely on negative coping strategies, have a remaining caregiver who is severely depressed and therefore unable to buffer and protect the risk factors associated with the death of a parent or caregiver, because they are themselves depressed and experiencing heavy levels of grief. And then, as stated, one study, or some studies have found that the loss of a mother could be more harmful than the loss of a father, but that has much cultural variation. As an adult, the death in the family context, loss of a spouse or partner often precipitates the need to move, entering the labor force, or changing jobs, assuming responsibilities that the partner formerly performed, parenting single-handedly, and coping with less money. So kind of all expected things you would expect to see with the death of a spouse or partner. You lose income sources. You now have to pick up on the tasks that your partner typically performed to keep your household moving along. You may parent single-handedly if you do not repartner. You may have to change jobs. Maybe you need more income. Maybe you have to move. Possibilities of a lot of instability in the household following the death of a spouse or partner. And to the right-hand side, you can see depressive symptoms following the loss of a spouse or partner. Continuing on, death in the family context. There's disenfranchised grief, which is grief that is not fully recognized or appreciated by other people, and therefore may not receive much sympathy or support. There's complicated grief, which is grief that is unusually prolonged or intense and that impairs functioning. About 15% of individuals, recognized by the DSM-5, and what is viewed as complicated grief varies across culture. And the idea here is for disenfranchised grief is that the way that you're grieving may not be recognized or appreciated by other people, so therefore they either dismiss that you're grieving at all or kind of dismiss the validity of your grieving process. And complicated grief is a medically recognized psychological impairment or psychological illness that occurs following grief, and it's only about 15% of individuals. But as I talked about before, there are a lot of cultural differences in the grieving processes process. So what symptoms may appear to be complicated grief in one culture could be actually normative of grieving in another culture. So dancing, partying, or mourning for longer periods of time. Those are all kind of culturally based practices following the death of a loved one or someone within your community. So it's important to understand the normative practices of a culture's grieving, and then finding significant variation within that particular cultural setting to diagnose complicated grief. Continuing on, a death in a family context, the loss of a child, it can often seem unexpected, untimely, and unfair. Parents are at times unable to make sense of a child's death. The age of the child who died has little effect on the severity of the grief. Siblings also grieve, but may not have support from parents. Study found that only 12% of parents whose young child died of an accident, suicide, or homicide said they found meaning a year later, 57% 5 years later. Outcomes on marriage are likely to be worse if the marriages are unstable before the death of a child. So kind of the ideas here is that the loss of a child has little, the age of the child who is lost has there are little age effects, I should say, when it comes to parents dealing with the loss of a child. That is, the age of a child does not typically strongly predict the levels of grieving among parents. So a child can be 1 year old or 12 years old, and you would expect similar levels of grieving levels, of grief, I should say, among parents. And you can see that through time, after you can see increase in meaning in a child's death, with 12% of parents citing having found meaning in a child's death within 1 year or I should say a year later following the death of a child, and that number rising to 57% 5 years later. And kind of like all things in all psychological events, lifespan events, I should say, that individuals experiences, we never experience an event in a vacuum. We're all bringing our kind of life history, our life histories and kind of the structures in which we live our life to the table. So in this case, we're bringing our kind of family unit structure to this developmental event that is the loss of a child, and marriages that were already unstable are more at risk of becoming more unstable following the death of a child, because they have their foundation is already rocky, and now they're experiencing kind of a new trauma, which puts additional stress on that social relationships, thus putting them at risk for worse outcomes, typically divorce, for example. So I wanted to talk about the grief work perspective, because this was kind of a real dominant understanding of grief for decades. And the grief work perspective is a view that to cope adaptively with death, bereaved people must confront their loss, experience painful emotions, and work through those emotions, and move toward a detachment from the disease. And this derived from the legacy of a Freudian psychoanalytic theory held widely in our society. So kind of the idea is like there's a step-by-step process. You have to confront your loss. You have to feel that pain. You have to work through that pain. And then you kind of move on from that pain, from that dead individual. You detach yourself from that person who is no longer living. However, as I talked about, cross-cultural studies may demonstrate that there are many ways to grieve. Thus, the model may be culturally biased. There's also little support for assumption that a bereaved individual must confront their loss and experience painful emotions. And there is no support for a view that we must break our bonds. Bereavement rituals in some cultures are designed to ensure a continued bond between the living and the dead. So kind of the idea here, again, that you confront these feelings, you gotta, and then work through it, and then you break your bond forever. There's very little to no evidence for any of these stages having to occur for successful grieving, with some individuals not having to experience this painful emotions or confronting their loss. And also the idea that you have to break yourself from the dead is a kind of a Western view of death and kind of your connection to yourself in your environment around you living and dead. So you can imagine kind of this individualized, enclosed self versus kind of this collective, not necessarily just with the living around you, but also kind of like nature and whatever spiritual kind of beliefs that a culture may act upon. Who copes and who succumbs? Coping with bereavement is influenced by an individual's personal resources. Secure attachment is associated with coping relatively well after a death, a coping style. The nature of the loss, which are violent deaths, child deaths are harder to cope with, and surrounding context of support and stressors. Social support aids in coping. Additional life stressors harm coping. Siblings can help each other cope. Adult children can help widowed parents. Bereaved individuals report they are most helped when they are allowed to express painful feelings freely, if and when they choose, rather than trying to cheer them up and talk them out of grief. So kind of the ideas here is that individuals' environments matter. What resources you're bringing to the table at an individual level, but often more importantly, many researchers argue more importantly, but at the collective level. So kind of family helping you through grieving process, and depending on who's dead, that can either be grandparents, that can be parents, that can be extended family, as we talked about with Latino Americans, but just resources, social, financial, emotional resources, those buffer the negative impacts of death within a family context. And it's important to allow, research suggests that it's important to allow individuals to feel that pain freely and not say, okay, no, you need to get over it, you need to feel happy. The truth is that if you're really happy and you think nothing but happy thoughts and you're not negative in any way, that's the way that you get over grief. And that's when I want to talk about real quickly this book that I read from Barbara Ehrenreich, which is Bright-Sided. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And what she found while learning more about breast cancer, and she's a professor, I don't remember what university, but she's a professor. I've written several books. And anyway, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she went online to kind of look at support groups. And what she found was just kind of this obsession with really any confrontation with reality, or dealing with any other emotion besides happiness. It was all the groups that she interacted with, and kind of the most popular groups at the time of writing this book, really focused on just ignoring all negative emotions and only focusing on positivity. And any feeling of negativity was kind of like making yourself get sick, and was kind of frowned upon, actively frowned upon, and really pushed. And these organizations pushed just kind of this pure joy, pure happiness, pure kind of everything happens for a reason kind of thing. But the most like kind of toxic form of that. And research supports, like I said before, that allowing individuals to feel pain and express those feelings freely is the best way for them to work through the grieving process. At least in particular cultural settings. And she argued that as well. She felt kind of disenfranchised, kind of alienated. She had disenfranchised grief. As I covered a few slides earlier, where it's kind of she's feeling negative about something, she wants to talk about it, link up with people about it, and being met with kind of scolding from individuals within the community, saying that that kind of thought process is not welcome here, and also by engaging in it, you're making yourself sick. And she called that kind of bright-sided thinking within the United States in particular, because that's where she lives. Bereavement can also have positive consequences through post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is a positive psychological change resulting from highly challenging experiences, such as being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness or losing a loved one. Growth seems most likely when the stress is significant but not crushing. So this kind of gets back to those earlier discussions of toxic stress, good stress. And the idea here is that when an individual is feeling distress from a death or a life-threatening illness, if they're able to or experience kind of significant but kind of lower levels or manageable levels of distress, it allows for kind of a growth opportunity or an opportunity to I don't know, develop maybe a sense of wisdom or just some kind of beneficial developmental effect, or at the very least, limit or negate many of the most negative long-term developmental outcomes associated with bereavement or loss of a loved one. And obviously, that post-traumatic growth is affected by the resources within an individual brings to the table in kind of their community, their country, their neighborhood, their family resources as well. So, which would allow those resources brought to the table would allow or would decrease the levels of distress, which allows an individual to be the negative effects associated with bereavement to be buffered, to be limited, and possibly, if that's culturally appropriate for the individual, kind of a growth opportunity. Not everybody wants that kind of growth opportunity, but at least to limit the most negative effects of bereavement. Taking the sting out of dying. So for the dying, hospice is a program that supports dying people and their families through a philosophy of caring rather than curing. Part of palliative care movement, which is aimed primarily at bringing comfort to and meeting the physical, psychological, and spiritual needs of patients with serious illness. So what does this entail? The dying person in his family, not the experts, decide what support they want and need. Attempts to cure the patient or prolong his life are de-emphasized, but death isn't hurried either. Pain control is emphasized. The setting of care is as normal as possible. Bereavement counseling is provided to the family before and after the death. And studies suggest that the relatives of dying people rate their quality of death experience more positively and display fewer symptoms of grief and have a greater sense of well-being 1 to 2 years after death than those who did not receive hospice care. So kind of the idea here is kind of to move on from this overly medical focused or biological focused emphasis on death, where we're just kind of obsessed with keeping an individual alive, even though they may have very low to no quality of life. And this involves a number of steps where pain control is emphasized, kind of trying to get out of this medical setting, so trying to make the setting of care as normal as possible, if that can be done at home setting or just in a setting that's not a traditional hospital setting or kind of a traditional setup of a hospital setting. And really bringing in the person who's dying, his family or other extended family community, depending on the culture, who come together as collectively to decide what is best for those individuals and the dying person. And research supports that this approach, individuals who take this approach have a better sense of well-being 1 to 2 years after death compared to individuals who do not receive hospice care. For the bereaved, most bereaved individuals do not need psychological intervention to cope. Those at risk for complicated grief, cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and self-help programs. So kind of the idea here is that people in general, as we saw from studies, are able to grieve, and most bereaved individuals do not need psychological intervention. However, if an individual is experiencing complicated grief, generally it's recommended that they receive cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and self-help programs. I should also add, where textbooks generally overlook, is that even national programs, this kind of goes back to the Bronfenbrenner systems. So just imagine a national program where funerals are free, for example, or there's more coordination at a state level, a country level, city level, of kind of working through rituals of following death. So be that a funeral, cremation, whatever it is. But kind of allowing, providing resources for those, so those cultural practices can be expressed. And you can also, talk about differences in medical programs, wherein, if you have a long hospital stay, you're going to have high levels of medical debt, which can leave individuals who are alive more stressed out, which may make them more vulnerable to complicated grief. Also, the idea of hospice care, well, it costs money. So, programs at a national level, country level, or a state level that allows for those programs to occur for historically excluded communities. So, poor communities and racial minority communities can benefit from those type of programs and reduce the risk for complicated grief. So now my goodbyes. So themes from my lectures and my course is that nature and nurture interact in development. We are a whole person throughout the lifespan. Development proceeds in multiple directions. There's both continuity and discontinuity in development. Psychology is far more than just the individual, and there is much plasticity in development. So I hope these themes kind of were illuminated throughout the class, that nature and nurture interact. And I really wanted to focus on psychology being far more than just this individual acting, or even just kind of a family unit where just your direct immediate siblings and family impacting an individual's development, but rather these larger cultural factors, these larger economic factors, and these country factors contributing to developmental outcomes within an individual, and not just negative developmental outcomes, but protective developmental outcomes. So, universal or food stamps is what I would call it when I was on them, but child free lunch programs for children, medical healthcare programs, youth programs, Head Starts, all these other large countrywide policies impacting individuals' development, as we learned from Prof. and Brenner, because those factors, those different environmental factors, interact with each other in dynamic ways, and as we know, we are able to change those environmental factors. So not just changing, recommending that an individual undergo cognitive behavioral therapy, and not just family therapy, but also targeting these larger structures in society that produce so many, or I should say these larger environmental factors that produce environments that produce so many factors, can produce positive and negative effects, and that are so important in development. So I hope that gave you a different perspective on what psychology is and how we interact with our world, and that specifically that our environments matter, and those environments are not just in our household, not just in our neighborhood, but at a country level and at a world level. And we develop in a cultural and historical context. So not only do we, develop within a household, within a country, within a globe, but within a particular historical context, and those historical contexts matter because of the types of environments they produce, and they also will reflect what our norms are. So what we expect from our environments and what our cultural practices are within a historical period impact the developmental effects of factors within that given historical period. We are active in our own environment, and development is a lifelong process. So everyone, thanks so much again for being in my class. I appreciate all your hard work this semester. If you ever need to reach out to me for any reason, please feel free to do so. I'm available to write letter of recommendations or provide general advice for any of your future career goals, including going to maybe a different university, transferring following Gulf Coast State College, or continue on whatever it is you're going to do in life. But yeah, feel free to keep in touch, and thank you so much for being in my class. And that's all.